During the long grind of the 100 Years' War, I watched France wrestle with a tough and determined enemy, the invading English armies. The English didn't just show up with brute force. They brought a well-honed system that blended the raw stopping power of their longbowmen with the steady resolve of heavily armored men-at-arms. Time after time, even when we French outnumbered them, our armies struggled against that deadly combination. Our commanders kept scrambling for some way, any way, to break the English style of fighting, and every experiment came with a painful price. In this story, I'm walking you through 8 of the most important early battles of that long conflict. Along the way, I'll show how the English system actually worked on the ground, what the French tried to do to counter it, and how we eventually managed to stand our ground against the soldiers who crossed the Channel to challenge us. The war officially kicked off in 1337. Not long after, England's King Edward III pushed his claim to the French crown and sailed over to enforce what he believed was rightfully his. He knew full well that France, an economic and military powerhouse in those days, could put larger armies in the field, and that a slow, grinding war would never favor him. So, right from the start, he aimed to force us into a single, decisive fight. Edward trusted that his men could hold their own against our heavy French cavalry in an open battle because England had spent years refining its tactics against the Scots. After the English suffered a disastrous cavalry charge at the Battle of Bannockburn back in 1314, they rethought everything. Instead of sending armored knights thundering in on horseback, they began fighting with a mix of dismounted men-at-arms backed by longbowmen. That combination proved itself at battles like Duplin Moor in 1332 and Halidon Hill in 1333. At Halidon Hill, the English picked a strong defensive spot atop a rise called Toppa Hill. From there, they forced the Scots to slog across sticky marshland, drag themselves uphill, and push straight into a hail of longbow fire. By the time the battered Scottish formations reached the English line, the dismounted men-at-arms held firm, while the archers hit them from the sides in a brutal crossfire. The whole thing didn't last long, but it was vicious. When the Scots finally broke and tried to run, the English men-at-arms climbed back onto their horses and chased them down, smashing whatever resistance remained. By the time the English reached our shores in France, word of that Scottish disaster had already reached our king, Philip VI. He understood exactly how dangerous the English system could be, and even though Edward kept trying to draw him into a fight, Philip refused to risk an open battle, even when the two kings faced each other across the fields in 1339. Edward set up his army on a ridge between the villages of La Capelle and La Flamengrie, digging a ditch in front of his line and throwing up quick field defenses. Behind those barriers, his dismounted men-at-arms formed 3 solid blocks, each one flanked by longbowmen. That setup made it clear just how important a strong defensive position was to the English style of fighting. But at La Flamengrie we learned something else. A position could be so strong that it scared off a fight altogether. When Philip's scouts saw how Edward had arranged his line, Philip called off the attack and instead dug his own army in behind a wall of sharpened logs and branches, an abatis. His men grumbled that he was being cowardly, and I'll admit his caution didn't match the French sense of honor. But in the end, that restraint kept France from suffering a devastating defeat at the very start of the war. Philip stuck to this careful approach, and because of that, the first big field battle of the conflict didn't even involve the two kings. Instead, it took place between their representatives during the War of the Breton Succession. Between 1341 and 1345, the main war between England and France paused several times due to truces, and attention shifted to Brittany, where a proxy war was unfolding. 2 men claimed the right to succeed the recently deceased Duke John III of Brittany. John of Montfort, his half-brother, and Charles of Blois, the husband of John's niece and Philip VI's nephew. Naturally, Philip backed Charles of Blois, while Edward III supported John of Montfort. To help his candidate, Edward sent William de Bohun, the first Earl of Northampton, to Brittany. The Earl landed at Brest in the summer of 1342, broke the siege there, and then marched off to take the fortress of Morlaix. Charles of Blois, who had initially fallen back, soon realized that his force outnumbered the English more than 2 to 1, so he turned and gave chase. When Northampton learned that the Franco-Breton army was closing in, he pulled his men back from the siege and positioned them at the edge of a wooded grove. His force, around 5,000 men, laid out traps, hiding them under hay and brush. We don't have clear records of every formation or movement that day, but the chroniclers agree that the English men-at-arms fought on foot. First came an attack from Blois' mounted knights, probably hitting the flanks, where the longbowmen tore into them. Then the French pushed into the center, stumbling through those hidden traps as they advanced. Even with those losses, they kept pressing forward until they slammed into the English line, where the fighting turned into a long, brutal hand-to-hand struggle. After hours of grinding combat, the English finally held the field. The Battle of Morlaix drove home two big lessons for me. First, picking the right ground and preparing it well could make or break everything. And second, the real backbone of the English battle line was always the men-at-arms. No matter how many arrows the longbowmen poured into the enemy, the opposing troops almost always managed to push all the way up to the English front. In the end, it was those steady men-at-arms, standing firm shoulder to shoulder, who decided which way the fight swung. Without that solid wall of armored fighters, the lightly protected archers would have been easy targets for any direct charge. English tactics worked because each part depended on the other. The longbowmen softened up the enemy on their way in, and the men-at-arms stopped them cold, guarded the archers, and finished the job once the enemy finally reached the line. With Morlaix, the English system proved itself on French soil for the very first time. Charles of Blois, one of the most capable French leaders we had, took that lesson seriously. Almost immediately, he began searching for a way to crack the English method. His efforts wouldn't bear fruit until 4 years later, at the Battle of Saint-Pol-de-Léon. By 1345, Edward III broke the truce with France that was supposed to stretch into the summer of 1346. He sent troops back into Brittany to push back Charles of Blois and secure a foothold for a larger invasion force. The first moves went well, but the campaign eventually bogged down because the English couldn't capture a port in northern Brittany. By the following year, Edward had settled on landing his main army in Normandy. Even so, Sir Thomas Dagworth continued westward, probably on a scouting mission, and wound up facing Charles of Blois at the small town of Saint-Pol-de-Léon. Dagworth had only 80 men-at-arms and 120 mounted archers with him, barely 200 men, while Blois brought a force of about 1,000. Dagworth was outnumbered by a mile. With no shot at retreat, Dagworth ordered everyone off their horses and set up a tight defensive position on a hill. He dug a ditch in front and threw together a barrier of wagons and horses behind. Blois, remembering how badly cavalry had fared at Morlaix, also dismounted most of his own men-at-arms. That decision made this one of the earliest battles where French men-at-arms fought primarily on foot. Once they were off their horses, the French fighters didn't lose much except the speed that mounted men enjoy. They were just as experienced fighting on the ground as in the saddle, and years of small sieges during the early war had sharpened their close-quarters skills. To make up for the lost mobility, Charles kept around 40 heavily armored horsemen and a group of crossbowmen in reserve at his rear. The Franco-Breton attack came from two directions at once. Charles sent his mobile force around Dagworth's flank to strike from behind, while his dismounted men-at-arms advanced in waves toward the English front. The flanking force slammed head-on into the English wagon line, and at the same time the longbowmen poured arrows into the men assaulting from the front. Even with those blows, the Franco-Breton troops pushed on, and the fight turned into a vicious, day-long struggle. Late in the afternoon, after being pushed back several times, Charles of Blois led one last desperate attack himself. With the sun setting behind him, he hit the English from all sides with 3 separate divisions, but once again, the English held firm and drove him off. The Battle of Saint-Pol-de-Léon showed just how deadly the English mix of dismounted men-at-arms, quick field defenses, and longbowmen really was. Even though Dagworth's men were outnumbered by about 5 to 1, not a single English man-at-arms was killed. Charles of Blois, however, lost a significant chunk of his army. Still, despite losing the fight, French commanders couldn't ignore what they had seen. Using dismounted men-at-arms paired with a mobile striking force offered the most promising answer yet to the English system. But this new approach wouldn't go untested for long. The first major field battle of the entire 100 Years' War was only weeks away. A quick note before I go on. If you enjoy historical fiction, Bernard Cornwell's Grail Quest series is a fantastic, well-researched set of novels that really brings the early battles of the Hundred Years' War to life. There's a link below if you want to take a look. Clicking through helps support the channel at no extra cost. And if audiobooks are more your thing, you can grab it on Audible through our link and get one audiobook for free. All the links are in the description and pinned comment. Thanks for considering it, and now let's get back to the story. When Edward III landed in Normandy with his invasion force in July 1346, he began cutting across France, plundering towns and countryside as he went. King Philip VI couldn't ignore that kind of threat. He had little choice but to ride out and confront him. Philip chased the English north from Poissy, near Paris, tried to trap them at the Somme, and finally, near the little town of Crécy. He walked straight into what historian Matthew Strickland calls the King of England's trap. The exact layout of the English line, along with many other details of the Battle of Crécy, is still the subject of fierce debate among historians. This isn't the place to dive into all of that, especially because Crécy stands apart from the usual French approach for reasons we'll get to later. What we do know is this. The English took up a solid defensive position on a hill between Crécy and Waudecourt. As they had done so many times before, they secured their rear with wagons and laid traps and fieldworks in front of their line. Their dismounted men-at-arms were arranged in 3 groups, with longbowmen guarding each flank. By the time the head of the French column reached the field, it was just before noon. Even though the English held a tough, well-prepared position, Philip VI ordered an attack before his full force had even arrived. Folks still argue about why he acted so quickly. Some say politics pushed him, others claim his own knights pressured him to charge right away. Whatever the reason, Philip sent the Genoese crossbowmen in first, and that's where everything started to fall apart. Their equipment, armor, extra ammunition, and most importantly their heavy pavises, had been left far behind in the marching column. Without their gear, the Genoese were practically naked on the field, and they were driven back almost immediately. The second wave, made up of mounted men-at-arms, charged right over the fleeing crossbowmen. It slowed them down and shattered their formation just as they entered longbow range. Still, the French cavalry pushed forward and slammed into the English right wing, where Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, held the line. Just as Edward III had planned all along, the terrain and the English setup forced the French into a narrow killing field right in front of the Black Prince's division. His men stood firm and ground down wave after wave of attackers. The assault dragged on until around midnight, and early the next morning the English men-at-arms mounted up and swept the scattered remnants of Philip's army off the field. It turned into one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war. For all his earlier caution, Philip VI did finally commit to battle, and paid dearly for it. People often say Crécy was a triumph of the longbowmen over French knights, proof that French tactics were outdated or disorganized. But that isn't really the truth. The defeat came from Philip's rushed, poorly coordinated assault. He ignored the lessons Charles of Blois had learned in Brittany. Matthew Strickland put it best when he called the Battle of Crécy a disastrous shambles. A performance that didn't reflect what French arms or French tactical thinking were actually capable of. And sure enough, in the years that followed, the French showed in several smaller fights that they were far more competent than Crécy had suggested. In 1349, for example, Thomas Coke, the English seneschal of Gascony, was ambushed near the village of Lunelong. He reacted fast, ordering his men-at-arms and archers to dismount and claim a strong position on a hill. Jean de Lisle led the French, outnumbering the English roughly 3-1, and he attacked with confidence. One division swung wide to strike the Anglo-Gascons from the rear, while 2 more divisions hit the front. The flanking group managed to grab some horses and supplies, but the frontal assault smashed into stiff resistance. The horses that actually reached the English line, those that survived the rain of arrows, were stopped dead on the spears of the dismounted men-at-arms. By the time evening rolled around and Jean de Lisle called off the attack, about 300 of his men were lying on the field. That fight confirmed once and for all that a direct cavalry charge against a well-positioned English force was practically suicide. After that, the French adaptation, the combination of dismounted men-at-arms and mobile mounted shock units, spread beyond Brittany and into the rest of France. In 1351, Marshal Guy II d'Aulnoy besieged the fortress of Saint-Jean-d'Angely and intercepted a convoy of reinforcements at a bridge over the Charente River near Taillebourg. Following Charles of Blois' example, he took most of his men-at-arms off their horses and kept only 2 cavalry reserves on the wings. He planned to hit the enemy both frontally and from the flanks. But his idea never got off the ground. Reinforcements from Taillebourg and Tonnay-Charente suddenly appeared behind him, catching him off guard before he could launch his attack. 2 weeks later, on June 6, 1351, Edward I de Bourgneuf attacked an English raiding force led by John de Beauchamp, captain of Calais. Near Ardres, roughly 600 kilometers north of Taillebourg, the outnumbered English fell back into a bend of the river and dug a ditch to secure their position. Once again, the French came at them with their new formula: dismounted men-at-arms paired with mounted shock troops. Although Edward de Bourgneuf was killed early in the fight, his men kept pressing. Eventually, the English archers ran out of arrows. That opened a gap, allowing the French cavalry to ride around and strike from the rear. Ardres wasn't exactly a shining example of French tactical brilliance. It was probably the English shortage of arrows that made the difference. But when paired with Taillebourg, it showed that the tactic of fighting on foot had now spread throughout France. The real promise of this new French approach became clear in 1352 at the Battle of Mauron. This time, Guy d'Aulnoy faced an Anglo-Breton army led by Sir Walter Bentley. Bentley positioned his men along a slight rise between a hedge and a patch of bushes. About 1,500 men-at-arms formed the English center, with around 800 archers spread out along the wings. Pretty much the standard formation by then. Once again, the French attacked both the front and the flanks. But this time, the first assault broke straight through, and the results were devastating. When the armored French horsemen slammed into the exposed side of the English right wing, that part of the line crumbled almost instantly, opening the English center to danger. At the same time, our French men-at-arms were pushing their way through the thick brush in front of the English position, hitting them head-on and slowly squeezing them back toward the hedge behind them. For a moment, it looked like the victory we had chased for years was finally within reach, until the center of our formation suddenly wavered. On our right, a section of the line fell back for reasons no one could explain, and that hesitation was all the English archers needed. They moved forward and shot straight into the exposed side of our troops. At the Battle of Mauron, we had come closer to breaking an English formation than at any point since the war began. Our plan had been working perfectly, right up until that strange, unexpected withdrawal ruined the momentum of the attack. Even though it wasn't the triumph we hoped for, that near success showed us exactly what was possible. It shaped how the French would fight in the next major clash. At the Battle of Poitiers, we were finally going to use the mix of dismounted men-at-arms and fast-moving shock troops in a full-scale fight. In 1356, the Black Prince led a destructive chevauchee from Gascony north into Poitou, burning and plundering as he went. King John II pursued him and eventually caught up with the English just south of Poitiers. Prince Edward took advantage of the chance for battle and claimed a position that was practically built for English tactics. A gentle slope dotted with hedgerows stretched out in front of him, the forest of Nueil stood behind, and the little Myosin River ran along his left. On the right side of his line, the English piled wagons and brushwood into a sturdy barricade. Edward organized his army into 3 divisions, each one flanked and supported by longbowmen. Between the hedgerows, the English dug trenches and built field defenses, tightening their grip on the ground. Behind their main line, a mounted reserve waited for any chance to strike or counterattack. On September 18th, as the 2 armies faced each other, King John II laid out his battle plan. He was determined not to repeat the disaster of Crécy. His men scouted the English position thoroughly, the army had rested well, and John had spent time thinking through every step. He divided his force, about 10,000 men-at-arms, 2,000 infantry, and 2,000 crossbowmen, into 3 large divisions. Each one had foot soldiers in the center and crossbowmen on the wings. Except for a couple of small cavalry groups totaling maybe 300 to 500 armored horsemen, everyone fought on foot. When the sun rose on September 19th, Edward prepared for the fight, but then pulled a move no one expected. He ordered his left wing to fall back across the Myosin. The French suspected a trap, thinking he might be trying to bait them into charging an almost unbeatable position. But in the end, they decided to take the risk and moved in for the attack. One group of mounted men rode around the hedge on the right, hoping to smash into the open side of the English center. Another group tried to punch a hole through the bushes to hit the English right wing. But as soon as the first group reached the hedge line, English archers caught them in a deadly crossfire. Arrows poured down like rain, dropping horses and scattering the riders. Meanwhile, the second group had almost reached the left flank of the English center. Just as they lowered their lances for the charge, the English left wing suddenly reappeared, having returned from the river ford, and crashed into them with a counterattack. Caught between two attacks and hammered by arrows, the French riders couldn't hold out long. With the mounted assault broken, the 1st French Division advanced on foot. As they pushed through the hedgerows, they took heavy losses from English longbow fire. Still, they managed to reach the English line, where the fighting turned into brutal, close-quarters combat. Despite the fury of the French attack, the English line refused to give way, and after 2 hours of grinding melee, the French were forced to pull back. Up to that point, every one of King John's attacks had failed. Still, he had 2/3 of his army completely fresh while the English were worn down. Many were hurt, and their archers were running dangerously low on arrows. But then came another critical mistake. The 2nd French Division misunderstood the situation. Seeing the first wave retreat, they assumed it was a signal to fall back as well. Instead of continuing the pressure that might have broken the English, they stopped their advance and pulled away. That hesitation from the 2nd French Division gave Prince Edward just enough breathing room to pull his forces back into order before King John's final division could hit him. Once again, France had let a real opportunity slip away. When King John finally pushed forward with the 3rd wave, he sent his crossbowmen out in front. Unlike the poorly equipped Genoese at Crécy, these men had everything they needed: full armor, plenty of bolts, and their heavy pavises. Step by steady step, they worked their way up the slope, shielding themselves and gradually tightening the noose around the English line. Little by little, the situation for Edward grew more dangerous. A lot of his longbowmen had already tossed aside their bows, useless without arrows, and switched to swords to fight hand-to-hand. Still, the Black Prince had one last card to play. Earlier, he had sent out about 60 men-at-arms, along with a few dozen mounted archers, riding in a wide arc around the hill on the far right of the battlefield. Now those riders charged straight into the rear of King John's troops. That sudden strike changed everything. As the French scrambled to turn and defend themselves, the Black Prince ordered part of his men-at-arms to mount their horses and smash into the already shaken French from the front and flank. The English horsemen thundered downhill, crashing into the French ranks with overwhelming force. John's division buckled, then broke apart entirely, and before long the whole formation collapsed. The battle was over, and France had suffered yet another devastating defeat. Roughly 2,500 French men-at-arms were killed, and another 3,000, including King John himself, were taken prisoner. The English, in comparison, lost only about 40 men-at-arms. But even with such a lopsided result, Poitiers showed something new. The English method wasn't invincible anymore. A full third of the French army had never even entered the fight, yet the English victory was far harder won than any they had claimed in the previous 20 years. Earlier battles were often decided by the very first arrow volleys. At Poitiers, even after 100 volleys had been fired, the outcome still hung in the balance. When the first phase of the 100 Years' War drew to a close with the Peace of Bretigny in 1360, the French still hadn't found a reliable way to break the English tactical system. But their adjustments, both in weaponry and battlefield technique, had made them far better at surviving the longbow's deadly fire. Fighting on foot made men-at-arms less vulnerable than mounted knights, and heavier armor combined with widespread use of pavises gave them even more protection. At the same time, mounted shock troops added the mobility needed for flanking attacks. These changes dulled the longbow's edge, but they still weren't enough to overcome the full strength of the English defensive style. It wasn't until the war flared up again in 1369 that France finally discovered a strategy capable of beating the English on their own terms. After Poitiers, Charles V effectively took control of the kingdom while his father languished as an English prisoner. He understood that trying to defeat the English by meeting them head-on was rarely the right answer. The real problem was that the English could roam the countryside at will, raiding, plundering, and besieging whatever they pleased, unless someone stopped them. Battles were the usual way to prevent that, but they weren't the only option. So Charles V embraced a Fabian strategy, avoiding major battles, wearing the enemy down, and relying on skirmishes, ambushes, and siege warfare. In these smaller fights, the French matched the English blow for blow. By 1374, France had taken back almost everything it had been forced to surrender under the Peace of Bretigny. Still, Charles and his father knew that reclaiming territory wasn't enough by itself. A lasting victory needed a stronger, more organized military. So in 1363, they began reshaping the French army into a modern fighting force. How those new armies eventually dealt with the English, though, that's a story for another video. Before I wrap up, I want to thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end. This kind of video takes a massive amount of time and research, and while we absolutely love doing it, it isn't easy. If you feel that this work is worth supporting, please consider helping us out on Patreon. It's one of the best ways to support creators, and for us, it means we can stay independent, able to choose the topics we believe matter, rather than chasing hype or trends that don't fit a history channel. Thank you sincerely for watching.